Camp Nelson is closely linked with President Lincoln's desire to free pro-Union sections of East Tennessee from Confederate control. Lincoln had been heavily lobbied by Tennessee Unionists and their supporters since Tennessee's secession in June 1861 to send federal troops into this region. In fact, as early as July 1861, Lincoln had ordered an advance of federal troops into East Tennessee. However, several logistic and strategic factors prevented any movement until 1863. In the spring of 1863, the new Army of the Ohio was organized and placed under the command of Major General Ambrose E. Burnside, with explicit orders to invade East Tennessee. Forces were joined together from the 9th Army Corps and the 23rd Army Corps to form the new army. Many of these forces had previously been under Burnside's command. To assist the campaign, Burnside ordered his engineers to find a suitable location in central Kentucky to construct a large fortified supply depot and encampment. The locale chosen in June 1863 was the high plateau above the Kentucky River at the southern tip of Jessamine County. This depot and encampment was officially named Camp Nelson on June 12, 1863, after the late Major General William Bull Nelson. The position was naturally defensible, being an area of approximately 4,000 acres surrounded on the western, southern, and eastern sides by the deeply entrenched Kentucky River and Hickman Creek. Both streams were enclosed by nearly vertical limestone walls and the palisades, which extended up to 500 feet. The only exposed portion of the camp was at its northern end. Here, a line of fortifications and entrenchments were constructed. Camp Nelson's location was determined by transportation routes and access. As a supply depot, goods needed to be shipped in and out as easily as possible. The southern Jessamine locale placed the camp astride the Lexington and Danville Turnpike, which was one of the best routes into East Tennessee. This location also placed the camp on the Kentucky River and at the only bridge, the Hickman Bridge, across the river in this region. The Oliver Perry House, otherwise known as the White House, is the only structure still standing from the height of Camp Nelson. Renovated to its original prowess in 2001, this house was once used as officers' quarters during the camp's existence. To look upon the camp now, the remnants of earth and stone fortifications and connecting entrenchments, and the few original camp streets, one can see only a hint of the vastness that was once a magnificent fortification. Camp Nelson grew rapidly and continuously from beginning to the end of its activity. Containing more than 300 wooden buildings and numerous tents, the core of the camp covered more than 800 acres on either side of the Lexington-Danville Turnpike. These buildings housed Camp Nelson's quartermaster and commissary depot, recruitment center, and hospital facility. The structures also included 20 warehouses to store 2 million rations, clothing, and equipment, and included 6 industrial-sized workshops to build and repair wagons and ambulances, repair harnesses, to shoe horses, and to provide lumber for building construction. Camp Nelson generally billeted 2,000 to 5,000 soldiers, originally from Burnside's 9th Corps, which had been transferred from the Army of the Potomac, later from the 23rd Corps. The camp also had a staff of supervisory officers and more than 2,000 civilian employees to operate the facilities, maintain the camp, build roads, and haul supplies. Some of these civilians prior to the recruitment of African Americans in 1864 were impressed laborers, with their slave owners being compensated for their services. Carpenters, blacksmiths, wagon makers, harness makers, teamsters, cooks, clerks, and laborers all served under Chief Quartermaster Captain Theron E. Hall. In order to feed, house, and supply the soldiers and civilian employees, Camp Nelson contained dozens of cookhouses and mess halls, a large bakery, numerous barracks, and hundreds of tents. The camp also had at least 3 permanent sutler stores and 2 taverns. Administrative buildings included the camp headquarters, a large quartermaster and commissary office, numerous smaller office buildings, and the post office. The camp contained a prison and provost marshal office. The prison housed troublesome Union soldiers and civilians, as well as Confederate prisoners en route to permanent prisoner of war camps in the north. At the southwestern edge of the camp was the Nelson General Hospital. This was one of the primary hospitals of the Army of the Ohio and consisted of 10 large hospital wards, a laundry, offices, nurses' quarters, surgeons' quarters, a cookhouse, a mess hall, dead houses, and a convalescent camp of tents. The U.S. Sanitary Commission also established a soldiers' home near the hospital for the accommodation of soldiers temporarily staying at the camp en route to join their regiments at the front. Because of the height of the Kentucky River Palisades, water supply was initially a problem for the camp. The Army therefore constructed a powerful steam water pump on the river, which pumped 150 to 175 gallons per minute, 470 feet up the Palisades to a 500,000-gallon reservoir. From the reservoir, water flowed by gravity to the warehouses, sheds, and barns for fire prevention, and to the hospital, soldiers' home, and headquarters, which had indoor plumbing and water closets, a feat that was very much before its time. Soldiers and supplies moved successfully in and out of Camp Nelson, but this couldn't go on for long without the inevitable threat of Confederate attack.
During my inspection of the depot at Camp Nelson, Kentucky, the post was threatened by a large force of the enemy under the command of John Morgan. The military force stationed there was entirely inadequate to its defense, and it became necessary for the better safety and security of the immense quantities of government stores in the depot to call for volunteers for this purpose. This was accordingly done, and without a single exception. All the employees came forward and offered their services for the defense of the place. 600 men armed, there being only this number of arms in the depot, and placed upon the line of fortifications. These men performed duty upon this line for 6 consecutive nights, and it is a measure due to them that the depot is saved from capture and destruction.
Despite the imminent threat, no advancement upon the camp was ever made. This left Camp Nelson properly equipped to play out its pivotal roles in the Civil War. This site, Fort Putnam, is one of the 8 forts that made up the northern line of defense. It has now been reconstructed based on original engineering drawings and archaeological investigation. From its establishment, one of Camp Nelson's missions was to recruit and train soldiers. Recruitment officers would venture from the camp to the county seats and other small towns and set up recruitment offices. The units were formed to perform a variety of duties throughout the war, including garrison duty in Kentucky and Tennessee, protecting railroad bridges in Kentucky and Tennessee, and participating in a number of skirmishes, battles, and campaigns. Camp Nelson initially recruited only white soldiers. 9 U.S. Army units were organized at Camp Nelson with regiments created from East Tennessee and Kentucky recruits. Many wives and children of the Tennessee enlistees accompanied them into Camp Nelson to escape Confederate occupation and seek protection within this U.S. Army post. Many of these refugees perished from disease and are buried in what was known as Graveyard Number 1. Also buried here are numerous African-American refugee women and children who entered the camp in 1864 and 65. A monument at this cemetery, located northeast of the White House, commemorates their plights. A greater significance arose following the first year of establishment. The camp became a recruitment center for African-American troops and became Kentucky's largest recruitment and training center for U.S. colored troops. As a non-seceding state, Kentucky was not affected by the Emancipation Proclamation, leaving many African-Americans in a precarious situation. Any issues touching on slavery were sensitive ones during the war years, and many white Union leaders in the state were against recruitment and emancipation of slaves. Lincoln and the federal government were hesitant to push recruitment of ex-slaves in Kentucky, always sensitive to threats of secession. It was not until the Conscriptive Act of February 1864 was passed that enlisting of slaves and free blacks began. After the February 1864 Act, which provided specifically for the enrollment of African American males, a flood of slaves and free blacks began arriving at Camp Nelson. By August of 1864, 2,000 black enrollees were at the camp. By the end of 1865, about 10,000 men, or 40% of Kentucky's African American soldiers, had passed through Camp Nelson, making it the most important recruitment center for African Americans in Kentucky. The 8 USCT regiments founded at Camp Nelson made it the third largest such center in the country. African American men continued to be enlisted at Camp Nelson as a means of emancipation in the late summer of 1865. Life in camp for the African American troops could be difficult, but as Sergeant Elijah Mars of the 12th USCHA stated,
"I can stand this," said I. "This is better than slavery. Though I do march in line at the tap of a drum, I felt freedom in my bones when I saw the American eagle with outspread wings upon the American flag, with the motto E pluribus unum. The thought came to me, give me liberty or give me death. Then all fear vanished."
The African American troops not only brought themselves to Camp Nelson, they often brought their families as well. Families were brought for many reasons, including fear of retaliation from angry slaveholders and anticipation of better opportunities, or even emancipation for the entire family. Since no clear Army policy existed for the treatment of refugees, and it was not even clear whether the families should be allowed to stay within the camp, the situation became rather ambiguous, and each commander had to set his own policy. At one point in November 1864, refugees were expelled from Camp Nelson by Brigadier General Speed S. Fry, camp commander, resulting in the deaths of 104. Due to reactions from the incident, Washington quickly directed Fry to establish a camp for the refugees within Camp Nelson. A direct result of Fry's actions at Camp Nelson and the uproar that came directly thereafter followed the passage into law in March 1865 of the act which freed the wives and children of the ex-slave enlistees. This act resulted in an increase in the enlistment of slaves in Kentucky and other border states. It was at this time Theron E. Hall was appointed superintendent for the refugees. Immediately, barracks were built to house the refugees in the southwestern portion of Camp Nelson. Soon following, duplex cottages were constructed and designated the Home for Colored Refugees. By June of 1865, the refugee camp contained 97 cottages and numerous tents and shacks, providing housing for 3,060 people, primarily women and children. The refugee camp also included a schoolhouse, hospital, mess hall, laundry, a lime kiln, teachers' quarters, and offices. Missionaries from the American Missionary Association assisted the Army in caring for the refugee families, providing clothing, supplies, teachers, and church services. The earliest missionary, and the one with the longest term, was Reverend John G. Fee. Fee was a well-known abolitionist and passionately believed in the equality of the races. He envisioned the refugee camp as a place to educate and train the freedmen to become independent, self-reliant members of an integrated American society.
Here are thousands of noble men made in the image of God, just emerging from the restraints of slavery into the liberties and responsibilities of free men and of soldiers. I find them manifesting an almost universal desire to learn, and that they do make rapid progress. I feel that it is blessed to labor with such people.
Soon after the Civil War, in April and May of 1865, military officials began preparing to close down Camp Nelson. By the summer of 1865, nearly all soldiers at Camp Nelson were African American, and the U.S. Army continued to enlist African American soldiers in order to free them. In June of 1866, the Army finally abandoned Camp Nelson, ending the military occupation of the area. But by this time, most buildings were quickly dismantled. In 1866, the largest Camp Nelson cemetery, or Graveyard Number 2, was designated a national cemetery. The present sections A to D are the original Graveyard Number 2 and contain the remains of 1,615 soldiers, including 837 USCT and even some civilian employees who died at Camp Nelson. In the summer of 1868, 2,203 Union dead from Perryville, Richmond, Frankfort, London, and Covington were interred into the National Cemetery at Camp Nelson. Since that time, veterans continue to be buried at the cemetery. It's understandable how the unknowing passerby could see this beautiful expanse of green and forest as that which was once something great. However, we must remember Camp Nelson, from years past through years to come, should be held proudly as a testament to those who fled here, fought here, and died here, taking up arms to protect and spread the freedom we now so easily can take for granted.